rain over Rome was not a gentle autumn mist, but a relentless, heavy downpour that turned the tarmac into a dark, shimmering mirror. This is the story of Ryanair flight. Inside the cockpit of Ryanair flight FR 4102 from Frankfurt Hahn, Captain Alessandro Moretti felt the familiar tension coiling in his shoulders. Please like this video and subscribe our YouTube channel Red Dot Aviation. The 737-800, a workhorse he knew intimately, shuddered as it descended through the turbulent, saturated air towards Ciampino Airport. To his right, his first officer, a capable but younger man named Marco, called out the checklist items, his voice tight. 1,000 to minimums. Continue, Moretti said, his eyes flicking between the instruments and the vague gray shape of the runway lights ahead, blurred by the sheeting rain. Minimums. Moretti looked up. He could see the runway, but just barely. The lights were smeared into watery streaks. His gut, an organ honed by 20 years of flying across Europe, clenched. It wasn't right. The crosswinds were savage, shoving the aircraft sideways. They were unstable. "Go around, flaps 15, he commanded, his voice calm but firm, the trained response overriding the adrenaline. He pushed the thrust levers forward to TO/GA power. The engines spooled up with a deafening roar, eager to climb. But the aircraft, instead of leaping skyward, gave a sickening lurch. A deafening bang echoed through the airframe, a sound no pilot ever wants to hear, the sound of aerodynamic stall buffet. The stall warning shaker on the control column vibrated violently. In a fraction of a second, Moretti's world narrowed to the instruments. The airspeed was bleeding away catastrophically. The go-around had failed. They were too low, too slow, and the 737 was wallowing, its wings losing the battle with the torrential rain and wind. "We're not climbing," Marco shouted, his composure cracking. There was no time for a second attempt, no time for anything but survival. Moretti's training screamed one thing: get the aircraft on the ground, now. "We're landing, now," he barked, pulling back the power and wrestling the controls, fighting to level the wings. The next 60 seconds were a violent, chaotic dream. The main landing gear slammed onto the runway with a force that jarred every bone in his body. The aircraft bounced, once, twice, then settled back down with a shriek of tortured metal. Moretti stood on the brakes, reverse thrust roaring, his entire being focused on stopping the massive machine as it hydroplaned on the flooded runway. He felt it veer, fighting for grip, and for a terrifying moment he was sure they would careen off the side. Finally, with a last shudder, the 737 came to a stop, skewed on the center line but intact. The cockpit was silent, except for the frantic hiss of the rain and the hyperventilating breaths of the first officer. The emergency lights cast a dim, eerie glow. "Evacuate! Evacuate!" Moretti commanded, initiating the emergency checklist. Behind him, he could hear the shouts of the cabin crew, the panicked cries of passengers, the inflating of slides. He stayed at his post, his hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, ensuring all procedures were followed until the aircraft was empty. Later, in a sterile office at the airport, the scrutiny began. The investigators, stern-faced men from Italy's ANSV, sat across from him. The tone was polite but pointed. "Captain Moretti, the data from the FDR shows you initiated a go-around at approximately 200 feet. "Yes," Moretti said, his voice hoarse. "And then you abandoned that procedure almost immediately and attempted to land. The aircraft stalled. We were losing airspeed rapidly. A continued go-around would have resulted in a stall and a much more severe impact. It was no longer a viable option. One of the investigators leaned forward. The procedure is to follow the go-around. The weather was severe, but within limits. Your decision to transition back to a landing from such a low altitude and unstable state, it could be seen as an error in judgment that contributed to the hard landing. Several passengers have been injured. Moretti felt a cold anger mixed with his fatigue. He looked at the men, these men who had not been in that cockpit, who had not felt the aircraft dying around them. An error in judgment, he repeated, his voice low but steady. The go-around was the correct initial decision. We were unstable. But when the aircraft failed to perform, when it began to stall, the only correct decision was the one that avoided a catastrophe. The book tells you to go around. It does not tell you what to do when the book's solution fails. That is where judgment comes in. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. That landing was not an error. It was a recovery. The airspeed was decaying. We were descending, not climbing. To have continued would have been to fly a perfectly good airplane into the ground out of a blind devotion to a procedure. My duty is to the safety of the aircraft and the people on it, not to the strictest letter of a manual when the manual's assumptions no longer apply. I made a pilot's decision. The result was a hard landing, yes, but the alternative was a fireball at the end of the runway. The room was quiet. The investigators exchanged glances. They had the data, but he had the reality of those seconds. He had defended his decision not with arrogance, but with the cold, hard logic of a man who had stared into an abyss and had to find a way out. The official report would take months. It would likely cite the severe weather as a primary factor and note the unexpected performance loss during the go-around. Captain Moretti's actions would be scrutinized, but ultimately deemed to be within the bounds of command authority exercised under extreme duress. He would be cleared to fly again. But for Alessandro Moretti, the investigation ended in that room. He had explained his actions. He had defended the split-second choice that saved lives. The sound of the rain on the window behind the investigators was the same sound that had been on his windshield that morning. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any official finding, that he had been right. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe our YouTube channel Red Dot Aviation. Thank you.